This week's reading from Living Wisely, Living Well by Swami Kriyanandaji, December 20. How modern do we owe it to ourselves to be? I myself was born in the then backward, nearly medieval land of Romania. Never have I made a great effort to bring myself into the modern age. Scientific discoveries have swirled around me. New fads have sprung up. New slang has been tossed merrily from person to person. New ways of looking at things have popped up like jacks in the box. I have chosen to keep myself a little apart from it all, accepting only as much of it as would help me. These pages, for instance, are being written on a computer. I say, pass serenely through life's fairground of excitements, but let nothing touch you that might take you out of yourself. I myself never watch television unless for some very specific purpose. I don't care to be either modern or old-fashioned. Time passes, but divine truth remains forever the same. Why not live in timelessness? Swami Kriyanandaji here is talking about one of the main elements of duality, which is time. The other one is space. I think Yoganandaji called the woof and warp of duality. These are the woof and the warp are the two different strands going each way, holding a piece of fabric together when it's woven. And duality is woven of time and space. And so when we are caught up and identify with the time that we live in, with our age, which I'll talk about in a bit, with the place that we're in, with this body that our soul is inhabiting. When we identify at all with these things, then we are caught in duality. When we live beyond them, we reach divine union with God, yoga, and ultimately divine bliss, which is, again, the ultimate goal, which is God, which is where we came from, and I'll talk about this some more also. Now, it's very interesting, the story of Ananda Sangha itself, because when I came to Ananda village, Swami Kriyanandaji's first ashram in California, I visited in 1976. I moved there in 1977. And when I moved there, most of the homes had already been burnt down in a fire, and people lived very simply. My first several months, I lived in a tent. And then I upgraded into living in a treehouse. And treehouse sounds very romantic, but basically it was a platform up in a tree with sheets of clear plastic as the walls. It was waterproof, but there was no heat. There was snow in the winter. We lived very simply. There was no water, no plumbing, no electricity. At that time, Ananda Village, in the residents, about 50 of us, there was one telephone for the whole community. We would all take turns using it when we needed to make a phone call. Most of the places did not have electricity. And it was a very, very beautiful, simple existence. We didn't need those things to live a spiritual life. Well, eventually, as the fulfillment of Paramhansa Yogananda's vision and his teaching for Swami Kriyanandaji to spread these teachings of yoga all over the world, that started to come to the fore. And so in order to do that, we needed technology. We needed telephones, we needed electricity, eventually we needed the internet. And these things were not things that we wanted or were attached to. They were simply vehicles to be able to share with others and give to others. And so try to see these things as not something to get caught up in, and to not get too excited about the latest technology and get too attached, and to, again, don't over-identify with the age in which we live. I grew up when televisions were just coming up, and we only had black and white televisions, and they were just this tiny little box that we would watch. And now all of a sudden we've just advanced so quickly, and I can't say that people are happier as a result of it. It's just fulfillment does not lie in becoming attached to, again, the time that we live in. my own experience with this was very interesting because in the mid-late 1990s, there was this new technology coming up that hardly anybody at Ananda Village even knew about, or they had heard of it, but no one was using it. It was called the internet. And I was aware of it, and Ananda at that time, someone created a very small website for ananda.org. It was about 10 web pages. And we realized that it was time to start to develop this. And Ananda has always been ahead of the wave. We saw that this was going to be a way to reach people. At the time, hardly anyone even came to the website. And I was given charge to really build the very first and develop the first ananda.org website. I knew nothing about web development. I had hardly ever even used the internet because there were hardly even any websites in existence. But I was given the task of developing it. And I learned these things. I learned the technology. I learned how to use these things, not because of any sort of attachment or desire to, but simply out of the desire to serve my guru and to share his teachings, because we saw that it was an amazing vehicle for giving to others, for broadcasting these teachings all over the world. And so as we developed it, it was with the understanding that this so-called technology really was simply a vehicle for giving to people, giving advice, giving counseling, giving online books. And Swami Kriyananda, his whole life has been one of giving and generosity and sharing with others, sharing inspiration, sharing God, sharing joy, sharing his guru's teachings with everyone that he could. And so this internet was truly a great vehicle for doing that. And it was very interesting because some years into developing ananda.org, it became many hundreds of pages, and we had video of every Sunday satsang from Ananda Village. We had several online books, and it really developed into something that was reaching many, many, many people. And one day, I was in our book warehouse at Ananda Village, and this person saw me from all the way across the warehouse. And he recognized me. I didn't know him, but he was told who I was. And he went running over to me and just expressed deep gratitude and appreciation. Are you the one who created this ananda.org website? It's saved my life. It's helped me so much. And he just expressed so much gratitude. And I had to sort of chuckle with appreciation that really what he was appreciating was not the skill or the technology or what we had done with it. What he was really appreciating was the generosity with which we shared and just simply use this technology as a vehicle for giving. And I told him, really, my friend, you really have Swami Kriyananda himself to thank for this, because he taught us how to be generous and how to give. And it was sort of a funny statement, because at that time, Swamiji had probably been on the Ananda website maybe twice, just because someone told him to go there. He never used the internet at that time and rarely did in his life. And so try to see all these things as tools to give to others, to help others, but don't get too caught up in it and don't get too excited in these things. So what Swamiji is saying here is to get past also the trends of society, the latest fad, the latest sort of way of thinking, because even ways of thinking, trends come and trends go. And the teachings of yoga and meditation, sometimes people wonder, why are you teaching meditation practices that are thousands of years old? Certainly there must be something better by now. And people are always trying to come up with that better and proclaim that this particular New Age teaching is new and improved and just discovered, and it's a better way to either use technology or, to work with the inner life. But in fact, the reason why meditation and yoga have been around for thousands of years is because they work. They work at the very core of our human nature. And yes, some technologies can help us with that, but they're not going to replace the basic necessity of using some self-discipline, concentration, regular daily practice of meditation. There's no shortcut in that regard. And so yes, use the current technologies, but also don't get too caught up in the latest fad or trend, whether it's a societal trend or fad, or whether it's just a new idea, or just doing something because all of your friends are doing it. Be centered in yourself and act from that center. In my own life, I would not be here at Ananda Sangha giving this satsang if I did not follow the call from within at a very early age. When I was in high school, I had a divine experience, and this experience convinced me to the core of my being to spend the rest of my life as a yogi seeking God. Those were the exact words that were in my mind. And it's funny because at that time I had never met a yogi. I just read a couple of books on gurus and meditation, which were very hard to find at that time. And society was very, very against this concept. I think if I had told anybody who was one of my elders that I had determined my future career and my future life, and that I was going to spend the rest of my life as a yogi seeking God, they would have probably called the high school psychiatrist and dragged me into the office and tried to convince me that I was crazy. But I knew from the core of my being that this is what I wanted to do. And I was not caught up in what society wanted me to do with career, with my life. And I can say that it was the most important and certainly easily the best decision I've ever made in my life. And it came from not following society's trends, but from following this divine call within. And that comes from having an inner life that, again, goes beyond duality, time and space, modern trends, gossip, fads, what other people are doing or wanting you to do. And so the yogi, really, in a way, their life is inwardly driven. And this is very important to having a fulfilling life that is free from the pushes and the pulls of duality, of time and space. Now, I'm going to read tomorrow's reading also from Living Wisely, Living Well, because Swamiji talks about how to get beyond the complexity of modern life and technologies and everything pushing at us all the time. He says, work at simplifying your view of life. Seek the simple unity beneath life's endlessly bewildering complexity. Complexity, whether in work or in relationships, only creates more complexity. To be divinely childlike means to discover perfect oneness in God's bliss. That last sentence to me is thrilling because it's one of the greatest, simplest, clearest statements of truth in how to find God. Again, I'll read it. To be divinely childlike means to discover perfect oneness in God's bliss. So I'll talk about two things here. What it means to be divinely childlike, and also what oneness in God's bliss really means. Divinely childlike. This means to be not identified with our age. And the previous reading was with the age which we live in. This reading is to not identify with our biological age. And our personality, our gender, the way we think, our job, our relationships. If we don't identify with these things, we start to have a very simple relationship with the world. And it's not simple-minded or ignorant or being a simpleton. It just means being calm, clear, and childlike. Swamiji often counseled people to be childlike. And he said not childish, throwing temper tantrums and things like that. That's not what it means to be childlike. Childlike means simply to have this childlike awe and wonder of the world, this childlike joy, this unconditioned approach to life. And this unconditioned approach means that it's contrary to the way that we become mature when we grow up. And you'll see too many people when they grow up that they become somewhat cynical, somewhat hardened, somewhat less awestruck by beautiful things that they see. And so this, again, it's identifying with your age, with what society has beaten into you and trained you how you're supposed to be and how you're supposed to think. And you see this sometimes with children growing up as they start to become teenagers. They want to be like adults, and so they start putting on this false sort of garb of being the sort of the cynical, mature adult and losing this childlike delight in the world. And not in the world itself, but just in seeing beauty and grace and joy everywhere. And so becoming divinely childlike is truly a very important goal of the spiritual path. And meditate again on this last sentence. To be divinely childlike means to discover perfect oneness in God's bliss. What is God's bliss? We talk about bliss a lot. We talk about it as the goal of the spiritual life many times. I just want to talk about this because it's very important to really understand what bliss is. Because if we want to, as I heard somebody say, if you don't know where you're going, you're not going to get there. And so if we don't know what divine bliss is, then we won't know how to find it, how to reach for it, how to look for it. So it's very important to have not just an intellectual understanding of divine bliss, but more of an intuitive understanding. Swami Kriyananda, near the end of his life, he was being interviewed and asked about God. And Swamiji said it very clearly. He said, God is feeling, and that feeling is Satchidanandam, divine bliss. And so he was saying God is not philosophy, God is not study, God is not intellectual understanding or anything of the mind. God is pure divine feeling. And you see that this is also a childlike approach of working with pure divine feeling. Divine bliss comes from understanding of the heart and not of the mind. Bliss is also divine union, because bliss is one. Everything else is duality, again, of time and space. Yoganandaji, when he talked about samadhi, which is union with God, he talked about it as samadhi bliss. In his poem, which I'll read some lines from in a bit, about samadhi, is all about oneness with God as divine bliss. Now, divine bliss, it is beyond duality. And so, in a way, it cannot be described, because any description of it would be comparing it to other senses of joy. And so, you really cannot say anything about it. You really have to understand it intuitively. The great Bengali saint, Anandamayi Ma, said about bliss, she said, He, talking about God, is the fountain of joy. Joy and joy alone is His being. A state exists in which there is only bliss, beatitude, supreme felicity. At your level, talking to most people, joy has its opposite. You speak of the joys of heaven and the torments of hell. But where there is eternal bliss, bliss in its own right cannot be expressed, meaning it cannot be really explained. It is entirely beyond such words as what is or what is not, because those words, of course, are still using duality to try to explain or understand something. And then she goes on to say, to speak means to float on the surface. What language can express that which is neither floating nor diving deep? And so she's saying essentially that divine bliss, because it's beyond duality, cannot be explained or expressed in words, which can only explain by relating it to other things, like pleasure and pain, or the joys of heaven, or the torments of hell. And bliss is beyond all these things. And this is why, to get beyond, again, the prison of duality, because when we relate to time and space and identify with it, our age, the time that we live in, our body, our personality, then we are bound by duality. And then we cannot go into divine union. Now, Yogananda, in his poem on samadhi, and I would recommend reading that chapter again and again. It's a chapter in Autobiography of a Yogi titled, an experience in cosmic consciousness, because that chapter explains the goal. And when we understand the goal, we'll always be looking for that experience of bliss. And the more that you look for something in meditation, in the stillness of deep meditation, looking with your heart and the feeling of the heart more than with the mind, you start to have glimmers of it, and you start to have taste of it, you start to have understanding of it. Because again, it cannot really be explained. It's not something that's understood at all. It's something that can only be experienced. Yoganandaji's poem, Samadhi, in some ways is perhaps the greatest teaching ever given, because it helps give a more intuitive understanding of what samadhi bliss really is by using the language of poetry, which is more intuitive and not explanatory. I'm going to read some of the lines from that poem, Samadhi, because it helps us to understand what divine bliss is and how it is beyond duality. That poem, Yoganandaji writes, "An oceanic joy broke upon calm, endless shores of my soul. The Spirit of God, I realized, is exhaustless bliss." And this is something that he actually is not in the poem. I made a mistake there, but it's as he leads up to describing that experience. His guru in that chapter that I just mentioned says, "The Lord has created all men from the limitless joy of his being." So we came from bliss, and we will only be happy when we get beyond duality and into unity with our true nature as divine bliss. Sri Yukteswarji also says, "Ever new joy is God. He is inexhaustible." Now I'll read some lines from that poem. Yoganandaji writes, "Love, hate, health, disease, life, death, perished these false shadows on the screen of duality." Again, he's saying that to get to divine bliss, to divine union, we must go behind that screen of duality into divine oneness. And he goes on and says, "Waves of laughter, scylla's of sarcasm, melancholic whirlpools, melting in the vast sea of bliss." And so he describes this bliss as something that is infinite. Again, infinity is beyond both time and space. Infinite in time, infinite in space. It's vast, it's overwhelming. Again, you cannot explain it in any way using words. Because again, as Anandamoyi Ma said, when we're using words, we're only floating and going along the very surface, and we're not going deep into a true understanding. Yoganandaji then writes also in this poem about how to have that experience. He says, "Smoldering joy, oft puffed by meditation, blinding my tearful eyes, burst into immortal flames of bliss, consumed my tears, my frame, my all." And when that bliss experience is had, it consumes all our desires, all our karmas, all of our attachments. This is why Yoganandaji counseled that we often think that we have to, in order to achieve that bliss, that we have to overcome this attachment, this desire, work out this karma, then we experience that bliss. He says it's the other way around. When you experience that bliss, that intense flames of divine bliss consume all of our karmas, all our desires, all of our attachments. So seek that bliss first, rather than thinking that you have to be perfect before you can experience it. In fact, it's in the experience of God as bliss, as divine love, as these different aspects of God, that we become purified and free inside. And so this is why yearning and seeking God, especially as bliss, is the answer to all of our problems. One time Swami Kriyanandaji was bemoaning to his guru that he had a desire, an attachment for food, which he enjoyed good food. And Yoganandaji first said, this is a minor thing, don't worry about this particular one. But then he also said, when ecstasy comes, everything goes. And he was talking about attachments like this. He didn't say, when you overcome this desire, then ecstasy will come. You put it the other way around. When ecstasy comes, then this desire will go away. And so again, this is what the yogi does. The yogi seeks divine union, divine bliss, samadhi bliss, in meditation, in service, in devotional offering, in all these different ways. And then all of our problems go away. You should also know that this divine bliss is not debilitating. In fact, it's enlightening. It helps us to understand people, it helps us to understand situations. It helps to, again, go beyond and behind the screen of duality and really understand what is going on. And it allows us to share with others. You see this with the great saints, and Swami Kriyanandaji was a very good example. His experience of God as bliss, which he never or rarely talked about his experience. But one day someone told me that they were with Swamiji very early in Ananda's time. It was in the 1970s. Swamiji was visiting this person's house, spent the night with some other Ananda people as they were going on a speaking tour. And people came out in the morning for breakfast, and people were saying good morning, and how did you rest? And this person was standing near Swamiji, and Swamiji said very quietly, in response to how he rested, he said, "Last night I was in samadhi." And this may be the only time he ever talked about these things. But you could see the fruits of it because he was so joyful. That joy expressed itself in all his words, his actions. Even when he was going through the greatest tests and karmas, there was still this underlying joy. And then the very end of this samadhi poem, which is, one other line actually, which is, "From joy I came, for joy I live, in sacred joy I melt again." This describes the soul's long journey through duality, from the very beginning when we were created to the very end, and we've achieved the goal. From joy I came, for joy I live, in sacred joy I melt again. And this is just, again, a very simple view of reality and the soul's long journey. And again, it's very helpful to try to simplify the spiritual path. We complicate it, we make things very complex because duality is very complex, and we're used to complexity, and we think complexity is just part of this creation. But it's really very simple. We were created from joy. We must try to live in joy, and eventually we will melt and merge back into God as divine bliss. It's the goal of life. It's the end of everyone's eventual search and journey. And so, by meditating on this concept, by trying to tune into and experience divine joy in meditation, we start to awaken, and the smoldering joy, as Master called it, oft puffed by meditation. And it's there, it's always there. It's been dampened down with water and just maybe steam is coming off and it's not very hot. But if we puff on it with meditation and start to awaken it and bring it back to life, then it bursts eventually into immortal flames of bliss. Finally, the very last few lines of the Samadhi poem: "Eternity and I, one united ray." Again, timelessness. Eternity and I, one united ray. A tiny bubble of laughter, I am become the sea of mirth itself. Repeat that last line to yourself, those last two lines. Yoganandaji, in a recording that I heard one time, he kept repeating those last two lines over and over and over again. A tiny bubble of laughter, I am become the sea of mirth itself. And he kept repeating it, almost as an affirmation. Because when we affirm that, then again we change our identity from limitation and duality, from identification with this time we live in, with the age of the body, with our body itself and space, and we identify with our true nature as divine bliss. It is who and what we are, and The more that we can meditate on it, tune into it, understand it, and experience it, much more quickly we will become free. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.